I am Ramona, 67 years old, and never in my life did I imagine my own son would strike me across the face during Thanksgiving dinner. I spent 3 days preparing a perfect meal-polishing family silver that belonged to my mother and setting out name cards in my best handwriting. When Jacob slapped me, everyone gasped. The neighbors who had joined us froze with forks midair. My grandchildren began to cry, but instead of tears, I smiled. That smile held decades of patience, love, and a decision already forming in my mind. If you have ever dealt with family members who take you for granted, subscribe now and tell me where you are watching from. My journey as a mother began and nearly ended in the same year. I was 32 when my husband Richard died of a sudden heart attack, leaving me with 3 children: Jacob, who was 10, Allison, who was 8, and little Thomas, who had just turned 5. The night of the funeral, I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by casserole dishes from well-meaning neighbors, and wondered how I would possibly raise 3 children on my own. Richard had been a good provider, working as an accountant at a local firm, but we had never been wealthy. The modest life insurance policy would cover the mortgage for a year, maybe 2 if I was careful. After that, everything would fall on my shoulders. I had worked as a part-time teacher before the kids were born, but had been a stay-at-home mom for the past decade. Within a month, I had taken on 2 jobs. During the day, I returned to teaching at the elementary school, and evenings, I worked as a bookkeeper for several small businesses in our town. Weekends meant picking up extra hours wherever I could find them. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. The children each responded differently to our new reality. Allison became my little helper, taking on responsibilities far beyond her years. She would get breakfast ready for her brothers and make sure everyone had clean clothes. Thomas, too young to fully understand what had happened, simply adapted to our new routines with the resilience only small children possess. Jacob was different. The loss of his father hit him particularly hard. As the oldest and the only boy, he seemed to feel the weight of becoming the man of the house, a burden no 10-year-old should carry. At first, he tried to help by mowing lawns in the neighborhood for extra money. I would find crumpled dollar bills on the kitchen counter with notes saying, "For the bills, Mom." But as the years passed, his helpfulness turned into resentment. By high school, Jacob had developed a sharp edge. When Allison or Thomas would be grateful for small treats, like a trip to the ice cream shop or new school clothes from a discount store, Jacob would roll his eyes. "Why are you so excited about that cheap stuff?" he would say. "Dads at school take their kids to Disney World and buy them real Nike shoes, not knockoffs." I tried to explain our situation, showing him our budget, teaching him about priorities. "It will get better, Jacob," I promised him. "We just have to work hard and stick together." The summer before Jacob left for college was particularly difficult. He had been accepted to State University, not the prestigious private college he had wanted. I had saved every possible penny for their education, but still had to rely on scholarships and student loans. The night before he left, he packed his bags in silence. "You could have done more," he said, not looking at me. "Dad would have figured out a way to send me to Princeton." Those words cut deeper than he knew. I had done everything humanly possible to give my children opportunities, often going without meals myself, to ensure they never went hungry. Jacob met Kathleen during his sophomore year of college. She came from a wealthy family with a father who owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. From the moment I met her, I sensed her disdain for our modest home and lifestyle. She had a way of looking at our furniture, our clothes, even our family photos, with a slight curl of her lip. When they announced their engagement 2 years later, Jacob had already begun to distance himself from us. Holiday visits became shorter and less frequent. Phone calls were brief and formal. Kathleen always seemed to have a reason why they needed to spend time with her family instead of ours. Meanwhile, Allison became a nurse, working at the same hospital where Richard had died. She married a kind social worker named Paul, and they gave me two beautiful grandchildren, Emma and Luke. Thomas studied hard and became a high school science teacher. He and his wife Sarah had 3 children of their own, Michael, Lily, and Sophie. My life took an unexpected turn when I was 54. A small educational workbook I had created for my students caught the attention of a publishing company. They offered me a contract, and within 2 years, my materials were being used in schools across the country. By 60, I had developed an entire curriculum that was adopted nationwide, bringing me financial success I had never imagined possible. It was around this time that Jacob suddenly renewed his interest in family gatherings. The first call came just a week after my curriculum deal made the local newspaper. "Mom, we should get together more often," he said, his voice warmer than it had been in years. "Family is so important." I welcomed his renewed attention, hoping that perhaps maturity had softened his resentment. But I soon noticed a pattern. Our conversations inevitably turned to questions about my business, my contract, my finances. When I mentioned donating to the children's hospital where Allison worked, Jacob frowned. "You should be careful with your money, Mom," he advised. "You never know when you might need it. Family should come first." By family, I gradually realized he meant himself. Still, I continued to invite Jacob, Kathleen, and their 2 children, Mason and Sophia, to every family gathering. I longed for the close relationship I had with my other children and grandchildren. Each time, I hoped this would be the occasion when Jacob would finally see that love and connection were what truly mattered. The Thanksgiving, when everything changed, had been preceded by several tense family events. At Allison's birthday dinner, Jacob had made passive-aggressive comments about the scholarships my other grandchildren had received from my foundation. "Must be nice to have Grandma funding your future," he had said to Emma's excited announcement about her college acceptance. At Thomas' summer barbecue, Jacob had cornered me by the grill. "You know, Mom, I could really use some capital for a business venture," he said. "Kathleen's dad would invest, but I want to do this on my own." "Well, with family help." He emphasized the word family in a way that made clear I was being tested. I had gently explained that I had structured my finances carefully with trusts for all the grandchildren's education and significant charitable giving already arranged. His face had darkened. "You always did prefer Allison and Thomas," he muttered before walking away. Despite these tensions, I still held hope that our Thanksgiving gathering would somehow bridge our differences. I wanted so badly for my family to be whole. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving filled me with both excitement and anxiety. This would be the first time in 3 years that all 3 of my children and all 7 grandchildren would be under one roof. I was determined to make it perfect. I started planning in early October, creating detailed lists for decorations, menu items, sleeping arrangements, and activities to keep the grandchildren entertained. My refrigerator door disappeared under colorful sticky notes as I organized every aspect of the 4-day visit. The menu required special attention. Allison's youngest, Luke, had recently developed an allergy to nuts, so I researched and tested nut-free versions of traditional dishes. Thomas' wife, Sarah, was trying to eat more vegetarian meals, so I added several hearty meatless options. For Jacob, I planned to prepare the cornbread stuffing. His father had loved, hoping the connection to Richard might soften some of his edges. I made sure to call Kathleen directly to ask about their preferences. Is there anything special the children would enjoy? Any favorites I should include? Her response was characteristically dismissive. Mason only eats organic free-range turkey, she said, and Sophia is on a gluten-free diet this month. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Rather than be discouraged, I took it as a challenge. I found a local farm that raised turkeys humanely and purchased special gluten-free flour to adapt my mother's dinner roll recipe. The guest rooms needed attention, too. My house had 3 bedrooms besides my own, which meant some creative arrangements would be necessary. I spent a week repainting the room, where Mason and Sophia would stay, choosing a cheerful yellow that reminded me of the nursery Richard and I had created for Jacob decades ago. I bought new mattresses for all the beds, splurging on the highest quality I could find. No one would be uncomfortable in my home. For the younger grandchildren, I transformed the finished basement into a play paradise. I installed a small basketball hoop for Michael, who at 8 was showing athletic promise. For 5-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Sophie, I created an art corner with easels and supplies. Emma, now 16, would appreciate the quiet reading nook I set up, with a bookshelf full of young adult novels. The handcrafted gifts took the most time. For each grandchild, I created a special memory box. Inside, I placed photographs of them with their parents and with me, ticket stubs, from movies we had seen together, small trinkets, from our shared experiences, and a handwritten letter telling them specific things I loved and admired about them. For Mason and Sophia, I had fewer shared memories to include, but I made their boxes especially beautiful, hoping to create a foundation for a closer relationship. Allison came over several times to help with preparations. One afternoon, as we polished the silver that had been passed down through generations, she noticed my meticulous attention to detail. "Mom, you don't have to try so hard," she said gently. "We're all just happy to be together." "I know, sweetheart," I replied carefully, buffing a gravy boat that had belonged to my grandmother. "But this might be the gathering that helps Jacob remember what family really means." Allison gave me a concerned look, but said nothing more. My phone calls with Thomas focused on travel arrangements. He and his family would be driving 6 hours from their home in Virginia, and I wanted to make sure they had everything they needed for the journey. "Have you had your car serviced before the trip?" I asked. "The mountain passes can be tricky this time of year." "Yes, Mom." He assured me, the affection clear in his voice. "We've got snow tires, emergency kits, and enough snacks to feed a small army. Michael's bringing his tablet loaded with movies, and the girls have activity books. We'll be fine." Just 2 days before Thanksgiving, Jacob called with last-minute demands. "We're going to need a separate bathroom for our family," he informed me. "Kathleen doesn't like sharing facilities." I took a deep breath before responding. The main guest bath was already prepared for them, but I offered my ensuite as well. "I'll use the powder room downstairs," I said, though it meant climbing stairs in the middle of the night, which was becoming harder on my aging knees. "Also," he continued, "we'd prefer to arrive around 4 on Thanksgiving Day, not the night before, as you suggested. We have a country club event Wednesday evening." This change meant they would miss the family movie night I had planned, complete with homemade caramel popcorn and hot chocolate. It also meant I would need to rearrange the cooking schedule to make sure everything would be ready later than planned. Still, I agreed. "Of course, whatever works for your schedule." That evening, I received a text from Kathleen with a list of changes to the Thanksgiving menu. "No garlic in anything. It gives Mason headaches. No casseroles too pedestrian. And could I please serve the cranberry sauce in individual ramekins rather than a communal dish?" I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by grocery bags and half-completed place cards, feeling a familiar anxiety creeping up my spine. The perfect gathering I had imagined seemed to be unraveling before it had even begun. But then I looked at the family photo on my wall. It had been taken years ago, when the children were young and Richard was still alive. We were at the lake, all of us laughing because the camera timer had gone off before Richard could get into position, and he was caught running into the frame, his face a comical blur of motion. That night, I followed my pre-holiday ritual. I set the dining room table with my best china, the crystal glasses that had been a wedding gift, and the embroidered tablecloth my mother had made by hand. At each place I positioned a small card with not just a name, but a message for Jacob. "Your father's smile lives in you," I had written, remembering the boy he had once been. Standing back to survey my work, I whispered a silent prayer that this Thanksgiving would heal old wounds and create new bonds. Despite everything, hope persisted. Thanksgiving morning dawned, crisp and clear sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows as I began the day's preparations at 5:30. I had barely slept, waking every hour to check the time, not wanting to oversleep on this important day. The turkey, a 20-pound bird, needed to go into the oven early if it was to be perfectly roasted by our now later dinner time. Allison and her family arrived just after 9, her husband Paul carrying a box of fresh flowers for the centerpiece. Emma immediately went to work arranging them, while Luke explored the house, exclaiming over the changes it made since their last visit. "Look at the basement, Mom. It's like a child paradise down there," Allison said, giving me a warm hug. "You went all out." "I wanted everyone to feel special," I replied, handing her an apron. "Now, are you ready to make your famous mashed potatoes?" We worked side by side in the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of chopping, stirring, and basting, creating a dance we had perfected over the years. Allison shared stories from the hospital where she worked, and I treasured these moments of connection with my daughter. Around 11, the front door burst open with the sound of excited children. Thomas, Sarah, and their 3 kids had arrived, Michael running straight to the basement to investigate the basketball hoop it installed. Sarah handed me a beautiful handmade wreath. "I made this for your front door. The leaves are from our yard." Thomas embraced me tightly. "The house smells like heaven, Mom, just like when we were kids." With Thomas' family here, the house came alive with activity and laughter. Lily and Sophie discovered the art supplies in the basement and soon emerged with hand-drawn Thanksgiving cards for everyone. Thomas and Paul took over turkey basting duty, giving Allison and me a chance to prepare the numerous side dishes. By 3:30, everything was nearly ready. The turkey was resting under its foil tent side. Dishes were keeping warm in the oven, and the dining room table looked like something from a magazine with candles waiting to be lit. All the grandchildren had changed into the nice clothes they'd requested for dinner, and an atmosphere of happy anticipation filled the house. At 4:15, well past their stated arrival time, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Jacob's sleek black luxury SUV pulled up, and I hurried to the front door to greet them. Jacob emerged first carrying 2 bottles of expensive wine, but no other contributions to the meal. "Welcome," I said warmly, reaching up to kiss his cheek. "I'm so glad you made it." He returned my embrace stiffly. Traffic was awful. Must be all those people who can't afford to fly. I chose to ignore the comment and turned my attention to Kathleen, who was directing their children up the front walk. She wore a designer outfit that seemed too formal for a family Thanksgiving, complete with glittering jewelry that caught the late afternoon Sunday. "Kathleen, you look lovely," I said sincerely. "Thank you for coming." She air-kissed near my cheek. "Your house looks quaint. Did you repaint?" Yes, I wanted everything to be fresh for the visit I explained, ushering them inside. Mason, 12, and Sophia, 10, followed their parents with the reluctant shuffle of children who had been extensively coached on proper behavior. I bent down to their level, though my knees protested the movement. "I've been so excited to see you both. Would you like to see what I've set up downstairs? Your cousins are already playing down there." Kathleen immediately interjected. "The children will need to wash up first. The car ride was filthy." And Mason, remember what we discussed about physical activities before dinner? I straightened up, trying to maintain my smile. "Of course. The guest bathroom is all ready for you with fresh towels and some new soaps I thought you might enjoy." As they moved toward the stairs, I heard Kathleen murmur, "Did you notice how hot it's set in here, old people, and their need for tropical temperatures?" Jacob didn't defend me. Instead, he nodded in agreement. Once they had gone upstairs, I returned to the kitchen to find Allison watching me with concerned eyes. "You okay, Mom?" "Imperfectly fine," I assured her, though I could feel a slight tremor in my hands as I arranged crackers on a cheese plate. "Everyone's here now. That's what matters." As I carried the appetizers to the living room, I noticed Jacob had stopped by the hall table where I had arranged family photographs. He was whispering something to Kathleen while pointing at a picture of Richard holding him as a baby. "That's one of my favorites," I said, approaching them. "You have the same smile as your father in that one." Jacob abruptly stopped talking and turned away from the photo. "I was just telling Kathleen how outdated some of these frames are. You should really upgrade to digital frames, Mom. Then you could rotate the pictures." "I like having them all visible at once," I replied. "Each one holds a special memory." Before Jacob could respond, a commotion from the basement announced the discovery of the gifts Id prepared. Soon all the grandchildren, including Mason and Sophia, who had apparently escaped their parents' supervision, came rushing up with their personalized memory boxes. "Grandma, this is so cool!" exclaimed Michael, already wearing the small fossil necklace Id included in his box. Emma, 16, and trying to maintain teenage composure, had tears in her eyes as she hugged me. "You remembered every special day we ever had together," she whispered. Mason and Sophia approached more cautiously, holding their boxes like unfamiliar objects. I had worked especially hard on theirs, wanting to make up for the time we'd lost. "I know we haven't had as many adventures together, yet I told them, but I've left space for all the memories we're going to make." Sophia opened her letter hesitantly and began to read. A small smile formed on her lips. "You really think I'm creative?" "I do," I nodded. "Your mother showed me the story you wrote for school. You have a wonderful imagination." For a moment, I saw a genuine connection forming. Then Kathleen called sharply from the doorway. "Children, put those away now. You'll get fingerprints all over everything." The moment broken, Mason and Sophia carefully set their boxes on a side table and stepped back, returning to their well-mannered reserve. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself constantly moving between guests, refilling drinks, checking on food, and trying to foster conversation between family members who had grown too distant. During one such circuit of the house, I noticed Jacob was missing from the living room where most adults had gathered. Acting on instinct, I quietly made my way to my home office. The door was partially open, and through the crack I could see Jacob at my desk opening drawers and rifling through papers. My heart sank, but I pushed the door open with a deliberate creak. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Jacob startled quickly, closing the drawer he had been searching. "Just looking for a pen," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Wanted to write down that wine I brought, so you could get some for yourself sometime. It's much better than what you're serving." There's a cup of pens right on the desk, I pointed out gently, and a notepad beside it. Didn't see them, he muttered hastily, scribbling something before brushing past me. I remained in the office for a moment, after he left, noticing that the folder containing my updated will and trust documents had been disturbed. With a sigh, I straightened the papers and returned to my guests, determined not to let this discovery ruin our family gathering. In the kitchen, I found Thomas carving the turkey with expertise, thin slices falling away from the bird under his careful knife work. Just like Dad used to do it, I commented, feeling a rush of gratitude for this son who had grown into such a thoughtful man. I watched him for years before he let me try. Thomas recalled with a smile. He was so particular about even thickness. Jacob appeared in the doorway, glass of wine in hand. Dad was a perfectionist about pointless things, he commented. Could have spent that energy making more money instead of playing happy family man. Thomas gave me a quick glance, and I shook my head slightly, asking him silently not to engage. Together we continued preparing the platters of food, maintaining our composure, despite the growing unease. By 5:30, everything was ready. I called everyone to the dining room, where candles now glowed warmly against the approaching evening darkness. Name cards guided each person to their seat, family members, strategically arranged to foster connection. Id placed Mason between Michael and Luke, hoping the boys might find common ground, and Sophia between her girl cousins who might draw her out of her shell. Looking around at my family gathered at the table, I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps this meal, this tradition, would be the beginning of healing for us all. Once everyone was seated around the Thanksgiving table, the dining room filled with appreciative murmurs at the spread before them. The golden brown turkey took center stage, surrounded by bowls and platters of traditional favorites, and the special dishes Id prepared, with each family member in mind. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, creating a warm glow that softened everyone's features. Before we begin, I said, standing at the head of the table, I'd like to say our Thanksgiving prayer. It's the same one my mother used to say, and her mother before her. I had just closed my eyes and begun. We gather in gratitude for this food and family, when Jacob interrupted. Can we skip the religious stuff, Mom? We're starving, and some of us aren't into all that. I opened my eyes to see Allison and Thomas exchanging glances of disapproval. My other grandchildren looked confused, having always participated in this tradition at our gatherings. Taking a deep breath, I nodded. Of course. Then simply, I'm thankful you're all here. Let's enjoy this meal together. As dishes began circulating around the table, conversation gradually resumed. Paul asked Thomas about the science program he was developing at his high school, and Sarah shared stories about the community garden shed helped establish in their neighborhood. The children compared school experiences, finding common ground, despite the different states they lived in. Jacob took a bite of the cornbread stuffing Id made from Richard's recipe and frowned slightly. This is different from what Dad used to make, he commented. Not as flavorful. It's exactly the same recipe, I replied calmly. Your father wrote it down for me the first year we were married. Well, you're obviously missing something, he insisted. Dad was particular about his cooking. Kathleen sampled the cranberry sauce from her individual ramekin and offered a thin smile. How quaint to make everything from scratch, Ramona. Most people in our circle use caterers for holiday meals. So much less stressful. I believe food made with love tastes better, I said, passing her the gluten-free rolls Id baked especially for Sophia. Thomas, perhaps sensing the growing tension, jumped in with a childhood memory. Remember when Dad tried to deep fry a turkey that one Thanksgiving, the way he ran around the backyard when it started smoking? Allison laughed, nearly choking on her wine. and Mom just stood in the doorway saying, "I told you so," until he admitted defeat. He was so stubborn, I added, smiling at the memory. But he could always laugh at himself. That was one of the things I loved most about him. The table filled with warm laughter as Thomas launched into another story about the time Richard had attempted to build a treehouse without any carpentry experience. Even Mason and Sophia were giggling at the image of their grandfather covered in sap and surrounded by crooked boards. I noticed Jacob becoming increasingly agitated as these stories continued, his jaw tightening and his wine glass emptying and refilling with alarming frequency. When Allison began recounting how Richard had attended every single one of her swim meets, despite his busy work schedule, Jacob abruptly set down his fork with a clatter. "That's not how I remember it," he said, his voice cutting through the warm atmosphere. "Dad was always working when I had baseball games, always too busy for me." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. I reached toward my eldest son. "Jacob, your father tried to balance everything as best he could. He was so proud of you. Don't rewrite history." "Mom," he snapped, "you always do this, paint everything, like we were the perfect family. We weren't. Dad worked himself to death for a family that was always struggling, and then you had to do the same. There was never enough of anything." Thomas leaned forward. "We had plenty of what mattered, Jacob. Love, support, encouragement." "Easy for you to say," Jacob retorted. "You were the baby. Everyone doted on you. I was expected to be the man of the house at 10 years old." The younger children at the table had grown quiet, sensing the adult tension. Seeing their discomfort, Sarah suggested, "Maybe the kids would like to eat their pumpkin pie in the basement. They could watch a movie." With grateful nods from several adults, she gathered the children, including Mason and Sophia, after a reluctant nod from Kathleen. Once they had left, the tension in the room seemed to increase rather than dissipate. I decided to try changing the subject. I started telling everyone about my plans for the foundation I'd established with some of my curriculum proceeds. "I've decided to increase the annual donation to the children's hospital where Allison works," I explained. "And I've set up a new scholarship program for future teachers in honor of your father." Jacob's face darkened. "You never mentioned any of this to me. Shouldn't family have a say in where family money goes?" I kept my voice steady. "This is my money, Jacob. Money I earned after your father passed. I'm choosing to use it in ways that I believe honor his memory and help others." "It's all about your choices, isn't it?" he said bitterly. "Your choices, your decisions, never considering what Dad would have actually wanted, never considering what I might need." Kathleen placed a manicured hand on her husband's arm, but rather than calming him, she seemed to be encouraging his outburst. "Tell her, Jacob. Tell her how you feel." I took a sip of water, preparing for what might come next. "Jacob, if there's something specific you'd like to discuss." "This isn't about something specific," he interrupted. "It's about everything. It's about how you played martyr all those years, making us feel guilty for every single thing you did for us. It's about how you favored Allison and Thomas, how you still do. It's about how you manipulate everyone with your sentimentality and your family traditions." Allison stood up, her face flushed. "That's enough, Jacob. You have no right to speak to Mom this way. She gave everything for us." Jacob laughed harshly. "Of course you defend her. Golden daughter with her perfect job and perfect kids. Did you know she paid for Emma's entire private school tuition? Meanwhile, I had to take out loans for Mason's school." I set down my fork carefully. "I offered to help with Mason's tuition, Jacob. You refused." "Because it came with strings attached," he shot back. "Just like everything from you does." The room had grown uncomfortably hot, or perhaps it was just the flush of tension coloring everyone's faces. Paul, always the peacemaker, attempted to intervene. "We all have different memories of growing up," he offered. "Maybe we could focus on creating new positive memories tonight." Jacob ignored him, his attention fixed on me with laser intensity. "I heard you're updating your will, Mom, planning to give everything to your precious charities instead of your own son." My heart sank as I realized what had been looking for in my office earlier. The conversation had now veered into territory I hadn't wanted to address during what was supposed to be a joyful family gathering. "My estate planning is personal, Jacob," I said quietly but firmly. "But yes, a significant portion will go to causes I believe in. All of my children and grandchildren are provided for equitably." "Equitably," he repeated with a sneer. "Another word for you'll give most of it away before we see a penny." "That's not what she said," Thomas interjected. "Mom has always been more than generous." Jacob turned his glare to his brother. "You have no idea what I'm talking about. You, with your modest teacher salary, perfectly content to be mediocre. Some of us have ambition, have dreams that require capital." The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. I decided to be direct, hoping clarity might diffuse the situation. "Jacob," I said. Meeting his eyes, "I earned this money through years of hard work, after raising all three of you alone. I have the right to decide how it's distributed. I've created trusts for all of my grandchildren's education. I've made provisions for each of you. But yes, I'm also giving back to causes that matter to me. That is my choice to make." I had barely finished speaking when Jacob pushed back from the table with such force that his chair toppled backward, crashing against the hardwood floor. He stood looming over the table, his face contorted with a rage I'd never seen before. "Your choice," he spat out. "Everything has always been your choice, hasn't it? After Dad died, you chose to work those jobs instead of remarrying someone who could have given us a better life. You chose to live in this small house instead of moving somewhere more affordable so we could have nice things. And now you've finally got money, you choose to give it away instead of helping your own son." Thomas started to rise, but I gestured for him to stay seated. The dining room had become eerily quiet. The only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from Richard's parents decades ago. "Jacob," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'm sorry you feel this way. I've always tried to do what's best for all of you. If you feel I've failed you somehow—" Somehow he interrupted with a harsh laugh. "You failed me every day of my life, Mom, every single day." Kathleen was watching her husband with a strange gleam in her eyes, not attempting to calm him but seeming almost pleased by the spectacle. She caught my gaze and smiled coldly. "Jacob has been holding this in for years," she commented. "You should hear how he talks about you when we're at home." I felt a stab of pain at her words but maintained my composure. The thought of my son disparaging me to his wife and children hurt deeply, but I refused to let it show. "Jacob," I said, "please sit down. We can discuss this calmly as a family." "Family," he shouted loud enough that I worried the children downstairs might hear. "What family? The one you manufactured with your perfect holidays and your selective memories. The one where you paint Dad as some kind of saint, instead of a man who couldn't provide properly for his wife and kids." Thomas stood now, moving to stand beside me. "That's enough, Jacob. Dad worked himself to the bone for us, and so did Mom. You need to sit down or leave." Jacob ignored him, focusing his fury entirely on me. "You never respected Dad's vision. He wanted more for us, for our family. He had plans, ambitions. But you were content to just scrape by, to teach us that mediocrity was enough. I shook my head slowly. Your father valued love over money, Jacob. He taught me that family wasn't about what we had, but about who we were together. Lies, Jacob roared, slamming his fist on the table, causing glasses to topple and wine to spill across the white tablecloth. Dad wanted success. He wanted to build something lasting. But you were too busy playing perfect mother to support his dreams. I stood then, unable to sit while Richard was mischaracterized this way. Your father was proud of what we built together. A loving home, 3 children, raised with values and education. What happened next occurred so quickly that later different family members would recall it slightly differently. Jacob lunged forward across the corner of the table. His arm swung out in an arc, and then came the sharp crack of his palm connecting with my cheek. The force of the slap knocked me sideways, though I managed to stay on my feet by gripping the edge of the table. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by Allison's cry of shock and Paul's chair scraping back as he jumped up. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, his hands still raised, as if he himself couldn't believe what had done. Then, his voice low and venomous, he said, "You ruin everything. You always have." I straightened slowly, my cheek burning from the impact. Our eyes met across the table, and in that moment a lifetime of hopes for reconciliation seemed to evaporate between us. But instead of tears, instead of the collapse he perhaps expected, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I smiled at him. Not a happy smile, but one of clarity and recognition. In that instant, with that single action, my son had shown me exactly who he had become and who he would always be unless something drastic changed. The dining room door burst open as several of the grandchildren appeared, drawn by the commotion. 8-year-old Michael froze in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. 16-year-old Emma pushed past him, rushing to my side. "Grandma, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, Thomas had crossed the room in 3 long strides. He grabbed Jacob by the shoulder and spun him around. "Get out of this house," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." Jacob shook off his brother's hand, a look of defiance still on his face, though I could see the first flickers of realization dawning in his eyes. Head crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "You can't throw me out of my mother's house," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Thomas didn't respond with words. He simply took his brother by the arm and began marching him toward the front door. Paul quickly moved to assist, flanking Jacob's other side. Kathleen stood adjusting her designer dress with deliberate casualness. "Well, be going now," she announced, as if this had been her plan all along. "Mason, Sophia, get your coats." Her eyes met mine across the chaos of the ruined dinner table. For a moment I thought I saw a flash of something like triumph in them before she turned away. As Jacob was escorted forcibly toward the door, he looked back over his shoulder at me. His expression had changed, the rage giving way to something else difficult to decipher. Perhaps the first inkling of regret, or simply the calculation of consequences. I remained standing at the head of the table, one hand gently touching my cheek, where the imprint of his fingers was surely forming. Our eyes met one last time before Thomas pushed him through the doorway and out into the cold November night. The front door slammed with a finality that seemed to echo through the silent house. For a moment no one moved. I stood frozen at the head of the table, surrounded by the ruins of the Thanksgiving dinner, 2ID. It'd spent weeks planning. The spilled wine had soaked into the white tablecloth, like a spreading blood-stained candles still flickered, casting strange shadows on shocked faces, and the turkey sat abandoned, half-carved. It was Emma who broke the spell, moving to my side and gently taking my arm. "Grandma, you should sit down," she said, her young face showing a maturity beyond her 16 years. I allowed her to guide me to my chair, aware of all eyes on me. Sophie's small face appeared in the doorway, her expression confused and frightened. "Where's my mom and dad?" she asked, her voice small. Allison immediately went to her, kneeling to eye level. "They're leaving a little early, sweetie. But you're staying with us tonight. We're going to have dessert and watch movies in the basement. Okay?" Behind her, Mason appeared, his preteen face struggling to maintain composure. I saw the tear running down his cheek before he quickly wiped it away. "I want to stay with Grandma," he said, surprising everyone. "If that's okay." "Of course it's okay," I said, finding my voice at last. "Both of you are always welcome here." From the front of the house I could hear Thomas and Paul speaking in low, serious tones, presumably watching to make sure Jacob and Kathleen actually left. When they returned to the dining room, Thomas' face was flushed with anger. "I called them a cab," he said. "I wasn't about to let him drive after all that wine and what he did." Paul nodded in agreement. "They're waiting at the end of the driveway. I told them Wed'd bring the kids home tomorrow." A knock at the side door startled everyone. Sarah went to answer it and returned with our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a kind, elderly woman who lived alone in the house next door. "I heard shouting," she explained, looking around the room with concern. "Is everything all right?" I managed a small smile. "We're having a bit of family drama, Margaret, but we're handling it. Thank you for checking." She didn't look convinced, but nodded slowly. "Well, I'm right next door, if you need anything. Anything at all." After she'd gone, Sarah began quietly clearing the table. "I'm going to start some coffee," she said, "and break out the pies. I think we could all use something sweet right now." The practical task seemed to break the tension. Soon everyone was helping to clear away the dinner dishes and restore some order to the dining room. The children were sent back to the basement with slices of pie, all except Emma, who insisted on staying close to me. Once the kitchen was filled with the comforting aroma of brewing coffee, I found myself sitting at the breakfast nook, an ice pack pressed gently to my cheek. Allison, Thomas, and their spouses gathered around me, concern etched on their faces. "Mom, you need to press charges," Allison said firmly. "What Jacob did was assault. I don't care if he's my brother." I shook my head. "No police. Hes still my son, and this is still a family matter." Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Mom, he can't just get away with this. What he did was unforgivable." "I haven't said anything about forgiveness," I replied calmly. "Just that I won't involve the authorities." A silence fell over the kitchen as they absorbed my words. I had never spoken this way about Jacob before, had always made excuses, always held out hope for reconciliation. Later that evening, after the kitchen had been restored to order and the younger children put to bed in their designated rooms, I found myself sitting in the living room with Allison and Thomas. Paul and Sarah had tactfully given us privacy, taking some of the older kids out for a walk to burn off energy. "I think I've been enabling Jacob for years," I admitted, staring into the fireplace where logs crackled and sparked, making excuses for his behavior, hoping he'd change if I just loved him enough. Allison took my hand. "You did what mothers do, Mom. You saw the best in him even when it wasn't deserved." Thomas sat on my other side, his presence solid and reassuring. "What are you going to do now?" he asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. The slap itself had been shocking, but in truth it was merely the physical manifestation of a disrespect and resentment that had been building for years. The public nature of it in front of family, neighbors, and even children had forced me to see what I'd been denying. "I'm going to set boundaries," I said finally. "Real ones, not the kind I keep moving whenever he pushes against them." We talked late into the night, the three of us remembering our shared history, the good and the bad. They told me stories of times Jacob had manipulated situations, even as a child, how he'd make them feel guilty for having things he didn't, despite the fact that I'd always tried to be scrupulously fair. I told them about finding him in my office, looking through my financial papers, about the increasing frequency of his hints and sometimes outright demands for money, about Kathleen's subtle encouragement of his worst tendencies. By the time we finally went to bed in the early hours of the morning, I'd made my decision. It was difficult, painful even, but also strangely liberating. The next morning I called my lawyer, Howard Goldman, who'd been a friend of Richard's and had handled all my legal matters since the publishing company first approached me about my curriculum. "I need to make some changes to my will," I told him, "as soon as possible." Howard, knowing me well enough to understand this, wasn't a casual request arranged to see me the following Monday. The remainder of the Thanksgiving weekend passed in a subdued but surprisingly pleasant manner. Without Jacob's and Kathleen's critical presence, the rest of the family relaxed. We played board games, took walks in the crisp fall air, and shared memories both funny and touching. Mason and Sophia, initially quiet and uncertain, gradually began to open up. By Saturday evening, Mason was playing basketball with Michael in the basement, their laughter floating up the stairs. Sophia spent hours with Emma, who patiently taught her to braid friendship bracelets, the two girls sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by colorful threads. Sunday morning, as promised, Paul and Sarah drove Jacob's children home. I hugged them both goodbye, pressing a small note into each of their hands. "You are always welcome in my home," I told them softly. "Always." Sophia clung to me a moment longer than necessary, and I felt her small shoulders shake with suppressed emotion. When she pulled away, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Can I call you sometimes, Grandma? Just to talk?" "Any time, sweetheart. Day or night." As the last car pulled away from my driveway, I stood on the porch, waving until they were out of sight. The November wind nipped at my face, but I remained there a moment longer, breathing in the cold air, feeling strangely at peace despite everything that had happened. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Jacob, the first contact since he'd been escorted from my house. "We're talking to a lawyer. What you did is parental alienation." I didn't respond, simply slipped the phone back into my pocket and went inside to pack up the last of the leftovers for the local homeless shelter. Monday morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching my somber mood as I drove to Howard Goldman's office. The weekend with my family, despite Thursday's dramatic confrontation, had reminded me of what truly mattered. Now it was time to protect that, even if it meant making painful decisions. Howard greeted me with concern when he saw the fading bruise on my cheek. I'd covered it with makeup, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. "Ramona, what happened?" he asked, ushering me into his wood-paneled office. I told him everything. The years of Jacob's growing resentment and entitlement, the discovery that had been searching through my financial documents, the confrontation at Thanksgiving dinner, the slap that had finally opened my eyes to the truth. Howard listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair with a deep sigh. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said. "No one deserves to be treated that way, especially not by their own child. Now, tell me what changes you want to make." I was direct and specific. "I want Jacob removed from my will completely." Howard raised his eyebrows slightly but nodded. and his children. I want trusts established for Mason and Sophia, I explained, for their education and well-being. But Jacob and Kathleen cannot have access to those funds under any circumstances. The money goes directly to educational institutions or to the children once they turn 25. For the next 2 hours, we worked through the details. In addition to cutting Jacob out of my will, I decided to increase my charitable giving, particularly to organizations supporting victims of domestic violence. It felt right to transform this painful experience into something that might help others. When we finished, Howard looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you sure about this, Ramona, changing? A will, especially to disinherit a child, often leads to legal challenges." I met his gaze steadily. "I'm sure. And if Jacob contests it, the witnesses to his behavior at Thanksgiving will testify to his actions and character. I don't think hell want that made public." Howard nodded slowly. "I'll have the paperwork ready for your signature by the end of the week. And Ramona," he added as I stood to leave, "I'm proud of you. It's not easy to set boundaries even when they're desperately needed." The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as I implemented my decisions. Jacob's texts escalated from vaguely threatening to pleading as the reality of my resolve became clear. First came the anger. "You can't do this. That money should stay in the family." Then the attempts at manipulation. "Dad would be ashamed of how you're treating your oldest son." Finally, the desperate backpedaling. "Mom, I was just upset. We all say things we don't mean when we're angry. Can we please talk?" I maintained my silence not out of cruelty, but from the clear understanding that engaging would only restart the cycle. Instead, I focused my energy on healing and rebuilding. At Allison's suggestion, I began attending a support group for people who'd experienced family estrangement. The stories I heard there helped me understand I wasn't alone, that sometimes love meant making the hardest choices. Thomas helped me hire a financial advisor to reorganize my assets, ensuring that my wishes would be carried out efficiently. The foundation I'd established to promote educational access received increased funding, and I took a more active role in directing its activities. Most importantly, I maintained and strengthened my connections with those family members who treated me with respect and love. We established a new tradition of Sunday dinners, rotating between our homes, creating new memories to replace the painful ones. I was careful to never speak negatively about Jacob to Mason and Sophia. When they called, as they began to do regularly, I listened to their stories about school and friends without prying into their home life. They needed a safe space, not another battlefield. Christmas came and went without contact from Jacob, though I sent gifts to his children with notes expressing my love. Kathleen's parents, who had never approved of her marriage, reached out unexpectedly to thank me for continuing to show kindness to their grandchildren despite everything. By spring, I had developed new routines and interests. I joined a gardening club, planted a butterfly garden in my backyard, and volunteered teaching literacy at the community center. Each activity helped me reconnect with myself as a person beyond just being a mother and grandmother. One warm day in April, almost 6 months after that fateful Thanksgiving, I was working in my front garden when a familiar car pulled into my driveway. Jacob got out alone, looking thinner and somehow diminished. I straightened slowly, gardening gloves still on, watching as he approached with hesitant steps. Gone was the arrogant stride, the entitled expression. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, "can we talk?" I studied him carefully, noting the shadows under his eyes, the nervous way he shifted his weight. "I'm listening," I replied, neither inviting him closer nor sending him away. "I've been in therapy," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "After what happened, after what I did." Kathleen left, took the kids back to her parents, said she didn't sign up to be married to someone like her father. I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that my heart ached despite everything. "I've been sober for 4 months," he said. "Working the steps, making amends is part of that." Still, I remained silent. Jacob looked down at the ground, then forced himself to meet my eyes. "What I did was unforgivable," he said. "I know that. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm getting help, that I'm trying to be better for Mason and Sophia, and that I'm sorry, so deeply sorry." I removed my gardening gloves, slowly buying myself time to process his words. "Thank you for the apology," I said finally. "I hope your recovery continues to go well." He nodded, accepting the neutrality of my response. "I also wanted to tell you that I'm not contesting the will. Howard told my lawyer about your changes. You have every right to decide what happens with your money." This surprised me. It shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it did. "Thank you for respecting my decision," I said. An awkward silence fell between us. In it, I could feel the weight of decades of misunderstandings, resentments, and pain, but also the faint echo of love that had never fully disappeared despite everything. Would it be possible to see you sometimes?" Jacob asked hesitantly. "Not right away. I know I need to earn back trust, but eventually." I considered his request carefully. The easy answer would have been no. The safer answer would have been no. But looking at my son, truly seeing him, perhaps for the first time in years, I saw not just the entitled man who had struck me, but also the grieving 10-year-old boy who had lost his father too young. "We can try," I said finally. "Slowly, with boundaries. Perhaps family counseling would be a place to start." The relief on his face was palpable. "Thank you," he whispered. As he turned to go, I called after him, "Jacob." He looked back, hope and fear mingled in his expression. "I'm proud of you for getting help," I said. "That's the first step toward real change." A single tear tracked down his cheek, which he wiped away quickly. The moment held no magic reconciliation, no dramatic forgiveness scene like in the movies. Just two imperfect people acknowledging a painful truth and the possibility, a small one, but real, of a different future. 1 year later, our family gathered again for Thanksgiving. It was smaller than I'd originally envisioned the previous year. Jacob was there, still in recovery, still working to rebuild trust. Kathleen was not. Their divorce had been finalized in the summer, but the children split their time between parents. As I looked around the table at the faces of those I loved, I realized that the family I'd fought so hard to preserve had changed irrevocably. Some bonds had been broken beyond repair. Others had been strengthened through adversity. New connections had formed where I least expected them. Setting boundaries had not been easy. Maintaining them was still a daily challenge. But in doing so, I'd discovered a freedom and self-respect I'd never known before. I'd learned that love sometimes means saying no. That forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. That healing comes not from erasing pain, but from growing through it. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with someone you love? Comment below and share your experience. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these struggles can be the first step toward healing. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more reflections on family forgiveness, and finding strength through life's challenges. And remember, it's never too late to choose yourself, to demand respect, and to build the life and relationships you truly deserve. Thank you for listening to my story, and may your own journey bring you peace.